Her. Bold. Brave. Her. With Dr. Pam Peak.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pam Peak, and this is episode 520 of the Bold and the Brave, Her podcast. Today, I'm joined by Mallary Tenore Tarpley. Now, she is a professor of journalism at Moody College of Communication, University of Texas at Austin. Now, there's a little mouthful. Okay, but here's the gig. This is the gig. She's going to be talking about her own experience with an eating disorder in middle age. What? Does that really even happen? Mallary, welcome to the Her podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to this.
Now, you're the author of a brand new book just coming out now. It's called Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. So a little backstory here. I first read about this in your book in the New York Times recently. And here they basically said, I'm going to quote, "For decades, few people connected eating disorders with older people. They were seen as an affliction of teenage girls and young women. And research suggests that an increasing number of older women have been seeking treatment for eating disorders, including bulimia, binge eating disorder, and anorexia, the latter of which has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder and brings with it an elevated risk of suicide." Whoa. Okay. Now that's huge. I spent many years working with eating disorders as I was looking at the relationship between food and addiction. And I remember working with anorectics at the National Institutes of Health while I was there as a senior research fellow in the National Institute of Mental Health. And it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life because I really got a chance to understand the depth and breadth and the seriousness of eating disorders per se, especially anorexia. So, Mallary, first, why did you write this book?
Well, it's such a great question. It's something that I've always wanted to do. I've identified as a writer ever since I was a little girl and knew that I one day wanted to write a book. But this idea for this book really began to crystallize when I was in my mid-30s. And I was thinking about all of the books that I had read on eating disorders. And the vast majority of those books were written from the perspective of people who were fully recovered, or they were written by clinicians. And while those books helped me in different regards, I felt as though there was this lack of a mirrored image, and that left me feeling really deeply misunderstood and alone. Because as a woman who has been in ongoing recovery from an eating disorder for most of my adult life, I have not reached full recovery. And so in reading all these books about full recovery, I was craving a book that really looked at what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And what does it mean to live with the imprints of your disorder? And so for me, I was really interested in exploring what I call the middle place, which is this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. And I really wanted to be able to amplify the voices of so many people, particularly women, including women in middle age who find themselves in this much under-discussed middle place.
You know, it's interesting as I'm listening to you, a new study just came out, and this was a situation that challenged the either or definition of eating disorders and obesity. And I always disagreed with that. I said, no. How do you become obese? What goes on? And I discovered when I was doing my book, The Hunger Fix, which was the first consumer book describing the science of food and addiction. What I discovered was something I kind of knew inherently as a physician who's dealt with this. And that is that binge eating disorder is rampant in obesity. So why are we separating these two? That makes absolutely no sense. If we had a little Venn diagram in front of us, there'd be a delightful overlap here. What I also found was that many people who had issues with anorexia sometimes then rebounded into binge eating, gained weight, sometimes became obese, sometimes not, sometimes engaging in bulimia, kind of getting the picture. It's all over the map. And we can't do the either or thing anymore, because that's not going to work. Instead, what we have to do is look at it in a more integrative way. So you started life with which eating disorder when you were younger?
It was anorexia nervosa.
Mm-hmm. And you were hospitalized?
Yeah. So 13, I was hospitalized at Boston Children's Hospital and spent several years in and out of treatment. So was at Boston Children's Hospital on the medical unit twice, on the psychiatric ward 3 times, and then I was in a residential treatment facility for 17 months.
Mm-hmm. And then what happened?
And then I basically went back to high school my junior year, and I was really intent on being the poster child for full recovery. Whereas once I was really intent on being the sickest anorexic, I now felt like I had gone through treatment and I really needed to achieve this gold standard of full recovery. And at the same time, I didn't quite know what that actually meant. What did it mean to be fully recovered? But in my mind, it meant not having any disordered thoughts, not having any issues with eating, not obsessively exercising. So I went about my later high school years really trying to eat well, exercise just the right amount, be in the top of my class, be the leaders of all of these different student organizations. And the pressure of that in some ways felt insurmountable because I was terrified of making a wrong move. I feared that if I made one mistake, one slip, I would slide back into dangerous territory and become acutely sick again. And so I went about this for about 2 years. And then my freshman year of college, I was beginning to experience these disordered thoughts again, which were very rampant when I was acutely sick. But I found that they were starting to creep back in. And I equated in some ways to my eating disorder knocking at the door. I could hear it knocking. I was beginning to have these disordered thoughts. And I did not want to let them back in. But the eating disorder just pushed its way in. And essentially kind of re-inhabited my life without my consent. And this began one night alone in my dorm room, freshman year of college, when I essentially binged for the first time. I had never had an experience like this where I was eating uncontrollably in secrecy. And I did not know that that is quite common among people who have had anorexia, that they then can go on to develop binge eating disorder or have binge eating behaviors. I had no idea that that was the case. And so I vowed to the next day restrict. And I said, okay, that was just a blip. I'm going to restrict the next day and then I'll get back on track. But very quickly fell into this vicious cycle of binging and restricting, and felt like I was failing at recovery and failing at anorexia. I did not know that there is such a thing as diagnostic crossover, which is just the terminology that describes how many times eating disorder symptoms can change. And even though you may have had anorexia at one point, you may develop symptoms or behaviors that are characteristic of other eating disorders. And so I grappled with this silently for over 10 years. I was stuck in this cycle. And at the same time, I still was carrying out this narrative of being a fully recovered girl because I thought that was the narrative that everyone wanted to hear. I thought that that was the way that I needed to live in the world. And though secretly I was very much struggling and I just didn't know why, and I didn't think I could ask for help.
And then what happened?
And then I really felt like I needed to make some sort of change. I, at the time, was working for an organization. It was called Images and Voices of Hope. And I was director of this organization. And I had been tasked with trying to develop what we called this restorative narrative genre, where essentially we were trying to help journalists to tell more stories about messy middles. So often journalists will tell stories about a trauma or a tragedy, and then they move on to the next story. And maybe we hear a 1-year anniversary story, but we don't hear about how people and communities are making meaningful pathways forward. And as I was trying to help journalists tell more of these stories, it occurred to me that this could be a really helpful framework for my own story. And so I began to then think about, what does it mean to traverse this messy middle between acute sickness and full recovery? And what might it look like to actually see slips not as grounds for failure, but as opportunities for growth? And so I began to adopt this idea of the middle place. And at the same time, I met my partner, who's now my husband, and found that I really couldn't hide the behaviors as much as I once had been able to in the past, because naturally I was spending time with my partner. We were together so often. And so I had to make a choice to really share my story with him and be vulnerable. And I thought that might push him away, but in fact, it drew us closer. And so this combination of reframing my thinking around recovery, meeting my husband, finally enabled me to get out of this vicious cycle. Didn't make the eating disorder go away, but it helped me to make some meaningful progress forward.
Wait a minute, I'm hearing some knocking. Is that knocking at the door again? That damn thing. I've always wondered, and that's why this article I thought was quite fascinating in the New York Times. And that was, is there really a black and white here? Is there really just a way to manage the dysfunctional eating, however you want to call it, because you can really, that's a very wide berth there for the definition. As you kind of course through adulthood with all of the typical challenges that take place on a day-by-day basis. Is it, the black and white thing bothers me somewhat, because it's kind of extremist thinking. When I'm always one of those 80-20 people, understanding, of course, with anorexia, that's a no, because anorexia has a 100% mortality rate if it's not treated appropriately. So needless to say, we all take it extremely seriously. But once you're out of that acute phase and now you're just trying to manage on a day-by-day basis, I wonder how one injects some humanity into the entire process so that you get to make some little, well, just like your title says, slips, just like somebody who never had anorexia. People are slipping all the time. That's actually, just part of life, muddling through and back and forth. But in the mind of someone who's had a very extreme eating disorder, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think for so long, and especially in the eating disorder field, we have really talked about sickness and full recovery in very black and white terms. And there's been so little discussion of the gray space in between and of the nuances of recovery. And for me, that is in some ways baffling, because I think that so many of us have to cross over this middle place. We don't just develop an eating disorder, get really sick, and then the next day we're better. Naturally, there is this progression through this space in between. And for many of us, we live our lives out in this space if we're not acutely sick and we're not fully recovered. And yet we don't talk about this space nearly enough. And for so long, the eating disorder field has pushed for full recovery for everyone. And I understand the sentiment behind that, because of course we want to show that recovery is possible. But I also think that, especially for those with eating disorders, we tend to share a lot of the same temperament traits. And one of those traits is perfectionism. And so if full recovery is presented as the only option, then naturally we are predisposed to try to be perfect at that. And anything short of that full recovery feels like some sort of failing. And so that can get very sort of just difficult to manage because we think, okay, well, I can't get to full recovery. Why am I even trying? And it can really keep people stuck. And so for me, it's been so helpful to think about how do I give myself grace when I slip? Because as you said, we are always slipping. And even that word slip, I've had some people say, well, that has a really negative connotation in our field. I wouldn't title your book that. And I've thought, but that's precisely the point, right? We need to destigmatize this word. And even if you think about that word slip, in some ways, it suggests forward movement because you can't slip if you're standing still. And so I think that we need to embrace the nuance of that, normalize this idea of slippage, and not believe that everyone can achieve full recovery. I also say that knowing that the field hasn't even come to a consensus definition of what full recovery means. And so it makes it hard to compare data across research studies, but it also makes it really confusing for patients to know, what does this actually look like, particularly when you think about how our society is so steeped in diet culture and fat phobia. It's hard to imagine fully recovering and never having a bad body image day or never having some level of discontent with the way that we look. And so I think part of what we need to do is broaden our definitions of recovery and recognize that recovery can take shape in many different forms. And there's no necessarily right or wrong way to recover.
Excellent. I brought up that whole point about, as it were, extremism, the black and white situation, because, women are just perfectionists. I mean, I hear it all day long. It's like, if I can't do it perfectly right now, then I'm just letting the whole rest of the day go to hell. And men are very different. They're like, yeah, it fell a little bit, I slipped, nobody died here. And they kind of, get over it, move on. It's like, come on, and I'm okay with that. Women are like, shaming themselves and blaming themselves and guilting them. and that's just a woman without, a history of anorexia. So I can only imagine adding a little bit more of that, another layer of complexity like that, really makes it kind of crazy to try to sit there and manage all this. Yet at the same time, there are some beautiful ways to manage, right? And so you interviewed a lot of people for your book, right? And I think that one of the most valuable things that we do as authors is we share stories. Stories exemplify, they bring something alive. That reader or, listening to Audible is really connecting and saying, wow, I resonate with that person's story. Whoa, that actually inspired me. That gave me some hope, or, whatever the issue may be, or maybe even triggered me. One way or the other, stories are like that. Tell me a story. Tell us all a story that comes to mind from the book that helps exemplify how this whole recovery thing and the lived experience of dealing with an eating disorder in middle age is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that stories are so important to illuminate. And I, for one, didn't want this book to just be about my own story because in many ways I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder in that I'm white, I'm a woman, I am in a smaller body, I'm middle to upper class. And so I wanted to really be able to interview lots of different folks of different ages and genders and races. And that was important to me. So I could broaden my own scope of understanding around eating disorders, but also open up more points of relatability for readers. And so one thing I was really struck by was talking with folks who have struggled with atypical anorexia, which is essentially a diagnosis where an individual meets all of the diagnostic criteria for anorexia nervosa, but they are not clinically underweight. And that term atypical anorexia is a bit of a misnomer because more people than not are not clinically underweight who have anorexia. And it's a whole sort of topic that I delve into in the book. But one gentleman I spoke with said that he mostly had lived in a larger body for his life, and he was restricting to the point where he was constantly fatigued. He was really doing damage to his body. But because he did not look the part of someone with an eating disorder, he was not able to get the help and treatment that he needed. And many times doctors would tell him, well, we just don't know what's going on, or we don't think you have an eating disorder. It wasn't until he fainted a couple of times that doctors then realized, okay, there's something serious at play here. And he finally got into a treatment center. I've spoken with many women who are in similar situations, and I was really struck by some of the stories from the older women who I had spoken to. I remember interviewing a woman who had just turned 70, and she talked about the fact that she had struggled with anorexia when she was in her teens, and then it morphed into bulimia. But then once she had children, the eating disorder symptoms really had subsided. But then when her youngest son went off to college, she felt like her sense of purpose had suddenly been stripped from her because she had really been just a stay-at-home mom for part of her career. She always loved being with her children. And suddenly she was at home without any kids there. And she ended up relapsing to the point where she ended up having to go back to a treatment center. But she found that most of the people in the treatment center were far younger. So she was in this treatment center with girls who were in their teens. And she felt like she had to take on this maternal role and really help to support these other young women who were struggling. She felt very out of place. And for her, she really felt like she needed to work on her recovery on her own. And certainly in an outpatient setting, she was trying to see therapists and other folks, but she couldn't really get the help that she needed to begin her recovery process because of her age and just because she felt so out of place. And so there are so many narratives like this that I weave into the book because I think it's so important to recognize that eating disorders don't discriminate and eating disorders can affect people of all ages. And yet so often they're still classified as a white teenage girl issue, which is really just not the case.
So interesting. I wonder whether or not, are there enough people out there with this issue based upon your research to really push the field to address older, relatively speaking to teenagers, older patients, male and female?
I think that there's an awareness, at least within the field, that older people do struggle, but there is a disconnect between that awareness and services that are actually offered. So certainly older individuals can see clinicians, whether that be a therapist or a dietitian, but when it comes to older individuals who need actual inpatient care or even a partial hospitalization program, there aren't enough programs that really accommodate older people. And so I think a lot of times those older people don't end up going to treatment because of that, or they go and they leave before they should because they feel so out of place. I do think that there are some advances in terms of virtual care, and that may not be the best fit for everyone, but there are some virtual eating disorder treatment programs now, like Equip Health and Within Health, that are really trying to help people of all ages, but especially older individuals who may be juggling work or still childcare, or maybe they're taking care of their own parents and they can't just go away to treatment. So I think some of these virtual options can be helpful for some, although there are some individuals who just find it hard to believe that it would be beneficial to get treatment in this way because they don't necessarily like the idea of virtual care. So there's a lot of different barriers, and I think we still have a long way to go in terms of figuring out how to best treat people with anorexia and other eating disorders in midlife and beyond.
All right. When we come back, I'm going to be asking Mallary this question. What are some of the biggest lessons you learned, shockers, from interviewing the 700 people, over the course of time? Was there an aha moment? Was there a shocking moment? We're going to find out in just a minute. The Her podcast is sponsored by Solaray Vitamins, Minerals, and Herbs, all rooted in nature. In addition to women's multivitamins, Solaray, Solaray, is presenting the new Her Life Stages products, providing support for the menstrual years, including PMS, perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, and even libido. This integrative holistic approach has a woman's back throughout her entire life journey. To learn more about Her Life Stages, you've got options. You can run on over to your local health food store or check it out at Whole Foods, Sprouts, Amazon, or scroll over to solaray.com and use promo code HER20 for 20% off your purchase. Women, Solaray's got your back. And we're back. All right, Mallary. What about it? With all these stories in front of you as you sat there writing this book, did you have moments that were just, whoa, that just shocked you? Like, I can't believe that's happening. Did you have moments where you said, wow, I really learned something. I'm going to actually apply that for myself. That's an incredible story. Tell us your thoughts.
Yes. So the stories that I heard were fascinating. And yes, I surveyed 724 people from around the world. And so got to interview hundreds of them and really was able to learn so much about people's eating disorder experiences and recovery experiences. And what was fascinating to me is that I asked in the survey if people could identify with this idea of the middle place. And 85% of respondents said yes, I can identify with the middle place. I am in the middle place. And to me, that was just so eye-opening because for the longest time, I thought I was the only person in this space, which may seem hard to believe, but this space is just not talked about enough. And so to hear that the vast majority of folks with eating disorders find themselves in this space really made me feel less alone. It also, I think, just was validating. And when I talked with folks about the middle place, they said, you know, I never had words to describe this space. And so I didn't really know how to talk about my recovery. And so I really just haven't talked about it with anybody. In some cases, there were individuals I interviewed who essentially had never talked to anyone about their eating disorder aside from maybe their spouse. There was one individual I interviewed from the UK, and she struggled with bulimia for most of her life, as well as alcoholism. And she felt like she just couldn't tell anyone about her disorder because anytime she had asked for help when she was younger, she never got the help. And that was just the case for anything, not even just her disorder, but she would ask her mother, you know, can you help me with this? She had been sexually abused and she tried to go to her parents about it and ask for help. And they said, just pull yourself together, right? And so she never got that help. And as she developed the eating disorder and the symptoms got worse, she still didn't feel like she could ask for it. And talking with me was really the first time that she had revealed her story in this way. And I remember that she said that she, after talking with me, began to actually start seeking help, and she started taking some medication to help with some anxiety that she had been feeling. We know anxiety and depression are often comorbidities related to eating disorders. And she said, you know, my recovery in some ways is like a spiral staircase now. She said, I try to take one step up and then sometimes I take a step down, but as long as I can keep taking steps up, I'm going to consider that a win. So she's still struggling, but the fact that she now is in a slightly better place simply because in part she was sort of revealing more of her story was quite powerful to me. And so I think that there are a lot of narratives like that. And I think that they speak to the power of being able to talk with someone else freely about the eating disorder without shame, without stigma. And there were many eating disorder clinicians I interviewed who had lived experience who said, I am in this middle place, but I don't feel like I can actually reveal that. And so they requested pseudonyms because they felt shame and they felt like they'd be judged if they admitted that they're not fully recovered as clinicians. And so I think that that also spoke to the fact that we still have a long way to go in terms of not judging people if they haven't fully recovered. So I could share so many more stories, but those are some of the ones that come to mind.
Would it be fair, Mallary, based upon your work, to say that recovery per se needs to be redefined here a little bit? I see it less as a destination and more as a process. And I think that the recovery continues until the day, your last breath. And we see this in trauma therapy. It's not like, well, I can't undo the trauma, so there it is. We already know, and you certainly looked at this in your book, but I'm a real epigenetics nutcase, and always interjecting that in my books. And, you have permanent epigenetic markers that will change your destiny based upon anything from what you went through, which was highly traumatic, in a very different way, with the hospitalizations and what was happening with your body, let alone your mind. And then you look at people who, underwent child abuse and other issues back and forth. Epigenetics basically tells us that these experiences leave a permanent mark on the genome and that you carry forward. So this isn't one of those, I'll get over it and, erase that thing and move on, will you? Instead, it's more like, how can I reframe the narrative so that I am now the person in control? So that I am not anorexia. My name is Mallary. So Mallary had an issue with anorexia, and Mallary is moving along now. It's just keeping it all kind of separate in that way. Just as when I deal with people with trauma, it isn't Jane who is trauma. No, Jane underwent trauma, and now Jane is managing. She is adapting, adjusting. She's moving it along. She's trial and erroring it. She has good days. She has bad days. She has epic fails. She has amazing triumphs. She's living her best life, one way or the other. So the way I look at it, I think I don't see recovery as a destination. I see it as a process. And that's really true even for the big, serious recoveries. All right. So there's no middle ground for heroin. I'm sorry, people, but that's just not the way it goes. You're either on this stuff or you're off this stuff. When it comes to anorexia, you risk your life. It's 100% mortality rate. So let's all get serious. That being said, the recovery process is that. It's a process. So you're moving forward. You've learned a lot of life lessons, and you're incorporating all kinds of resources. We're going to go to that right now. So the resources, everything from physical activity, and notice I didn't even say the E word, exercise, because for a lot of people, it's like, how many calories, and people start going down the little rabbit holes of metrics and those kinds of things. Instead, it's just get up and enjoy nature. Let's all take a hike. Right. And let's get out with our dog, or as I say, walk your dog, even if you don't have one, just get on out there and that type of thing. Journaling, having friends, good resources around you, great sleep, learning new tools and tips and techniques about stress management. All of these things help bolster what you're talking about, Mallary. Right? So that you don't hear the little knock at the door.
Yeah.
Right? Let's talk about resources. What do you think?
Yeah. So I do think, just to piggyback off what you were saying, that it's so true to really think about recovery not as this finish line, right? I used to think of it as a series of arrows pointing to a finish line, but now I think of it more as a series of circles that move in a forward direction. And the size of those circles can shrink or expand depending on life's ebbs and flows. So if we're going through a really hard transition, whether that be divorce or menopause, maybe the size of that circle shrinks a little bit, but then we have that slip, we get back on track, the size of that circle expands. And so I think it's really important to not think of recovery as this finish line that you cross, but really as something that you have to actively work on. And for me, that's been really helpful to think about. In terms of resources, I do think that certainly being able to really have folks to talk to is so important. When I started writing this book, I actually went back to therapy. And so I still now see a therapist and a dietitian. And 10 years ago, I would have been ashamed to even try to seek help because I would have thought, well, I'm in an okay place. I don't need that anymore. But if I want to continue to aim for more recovery, then for me, it's really important to be able to still rely on professionals for help. Certainly, too, writing this book was difficult, and that I had to excavate a lot of my past and relive, in some ways, some of these past experiences. And so I really wanted to be able to talk to somebody as I moved through that writing process. But also resources. I mean, there's certainly a lot of virtual support groups, which I think can be wonderful for folks, because sometimes it's just a matter of feeling like you're part of something bigger, because the eating disorder can be so isolating. And so the National Alliance for Eating Disorders, for instance, they have a virtual group specifically for women who are middle-aged or older. They have support groups for men. They have support groups for all different types of individuals. And so I think sometimes finding those communities or a trusted clinician can make a really big difference in terms of making sure that you don't get stuck in the middle place, but that you're able to keep moving forward.
Not feeling alone is one of the most powerful elements of the recovery process. If you know that there are people out there who say, yeah, I did the same thing. Let me share, some of the things that what happened to me. And now I'm going to share some of the tools I use to be able to get myself out of that little mess. Right. And then you say, wow. So now you're learning, you're listening, you're not feeling so alone. And suddenly you feel like you have a tribe out there. A little tribe. It's always important to have tribes in life. And when I read that article in the New York Times, what I was sensing was a sense of aloneness on the part of all of these, in this case, it seemed to be women mostly. The name of the article was Anorexia in Middle Age and Beyond. A growing number of older women are seeking treatment for eating disorders. Many have struggled without help for decades. And what I got from your book was that the mass majority are not getting help. And that's a shame because they're out there just, struggling along. And at the same time, if you go to the other end of the spectrum to obesity, so many of these people are not getting the appropriate help for binge eating disorder, which is basically stoking the fires and keeping, the obese state as it is. So I really congratulate you on two levels. The first level is being courageous and brave enough to share your own story. It's always scary. It's like, it's the big reveal. And, who's going to read it? Who's going to, judge what's going to happen? Well, as an author, I'm going to tell you something, honey. Screw them all if they don't like it. Just write your little heart out like you did and share your story. And, it's going to resonate because you interviewed over 700 people who basically affirmed, right, and validated where you were coming from, which is, well, wait a minute now, there's a real gap in care here. And that we really need to be aware and acknowledge what's going on. for this fairly sizable demographic of people. And that the other thing that's interesting, once again, it reminds me of the trauma group. There's a secret demographic out there. They're quiet. They're not sharing, just like your lady in the UK. They're just keeping it all to themselves. So I'll take whatever number you have predicted that are out there, and I'll double that, triple it, and tell you that that's probably more than likely what's going on. It reminds me of when my wonderful colleague, Dr. Vince Felitti, was at the Kaiser Permanente medical system. And what he wanted to do was just kind of, gather some data on the demographic and, some of the usual doctorly data. And they were trying to update information and this and that. And it was just, this is the way great science happens. And after all my years at the NIH, I can tell you this is exactly true. It's like when you ask that question, I wonder what would happen if, on Fridays, I used to collect myself with everyone else around our mentor, and we would ask that question for grins and just come up with all kinds of wild thoughts. I wonder what would happen if, with regard to our experiments, anything else we were doing. So he said, I wonder what would happen if I asked people if they'd ever had any kind of trauma as a child. And they all looked at him like, why do you want to know that? He says, I don't know. We could be missing something. And he says, what's the harm? They just go, yes, no, and then, fill in whatever if it's a yes. He found, and this is what started with the adverse childhood experiences scale. He found that 1 out of 3 adults in about 44,000 of the people he surveyed had that kind of trauma. And from that spawned an entire field. So then I sat back, I thought, damn, I'm not surprised because I come from the trauma field, but it's like, my God. So now we have a wake-up call. Well, I think, Mallary, if you kind of hang in there, right, and you keep digging around, foraging, and doing your thing, that you may be on the verge of doing exactly the same thing with your colleagues. And that is really bringing to the fore something that has been hidden in shame, guilt, misunderstandings, misconceptions, assumptions, and really come out and be honest now. Let's find out truly how prevalent this truly is, and then run with it, because I think you can help so many people. And I hope that the eating disorder associations, which I know very, very well, are listening to you. Have you gotten any kind of feedback from these happy campers?
I have, yes. I've been trying to attend a lot of eating disorder conferences and get to know the treatment centers, and interviewed some folks from them for the book, because I thought, well, I want to get their take on all of this, but I also in some ways want them to buy into this idea that we need to be able to talk more freely about slips and imperfections and the messiness of recovery. And I think if I had written this book 10 years ago, I probably would have gotten a lot more pushback from folks who may have accused me of trying to promote quasi-recovery or pseudo-recovery, which are terms that are often used in the eating disorder field to describe people who are no longer acutely sick, but not fully recovered. And I think those terms can be really harmful because they make people feel like the recovery is not real. I know that certainly I used to feel that way when I would hear those terms. And so I think there's a greater understanding that we need to shift the language we use. Even when I was presenting at an eating disorder conference just last month, someone looked at a poster presentation I'd done on the middle place and they said, "Oh, so this is basically quasi recovery." And I said, "No, it's not quasi recovery, right? This is about real active recovery. This is something different. This is not meant to shame people if they're not all better." And so I think that hopefully treatment centers will recognize that we need to have really hard conversations about what recovery looks like, because in many cases, recovery is just really beginning, or the hard part of recovery is really beginning once folks leave treatment centers. They don't just sort of fully recover in treatment and then go home and they're on their merry way. So much of the hard work happens after that fact. And so I think we need to recognize that and really follow through with patients 6 months out, 1 year out, and really see, how are you doing, right? Because it's easy to think that patients who leave treatment are better if their weight restored or if they're not exhibiting behaviors. But the real test is when they go home and they're out in the world living their lives. So I do hope that in reading this book, people will feel like they're seen, they're heard. Even after the New York Times piece came out, I got so many notes from older women who said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're doing this work, because I've not read any stories about this middle place, nor have I read stories about older women who are still struggling." And so I think that there's this whole demographic of people who have felt invisible for far too long. And I think we really need to give them a space to share their stories and to validate where they're at in their recovery.
Have you thought about what you want to do next in terms of really getting this out? So now you have the book, and let me just give you a little lesson, if I can, about some of the blowback and the rest of it. What did I tell you before? Screw them. So what you're going to do is you're going to hold on to your beliefs. You have a lived experience. You're not just some academic studying this because it was a groovy thing to do. You had a personal and a professional goal here in writing this book. And, so long as you're sitting back as you did, studying things methodically, really looking at misconceptions, reframing and redefining, so that we can finally push forward instead of getting stuck back, where dinosaurs rule the earth. I think it takes bravery and courage to do this in the face of some academics and others within the industry, who may not agree with you and call you, quasi this and that. I was just laughing. I was thinking back to myself when I wrote my first book. This was based upon some work with the NIH where I had in my laboratory helped contribute to what the metabolic syndrome was. And what I found, based upon the patients we were working with, et cetera, was that stress literally makes you fat. In other words, chronic elevations of cortisol, which is stress hormone, can actually, expand the visceral, the deep inside the belly level of fat for a whole host of metabolic reasons we didn't fully understand at that time, but I added a piece of the puzzle to it. And I remember when my book came out and they said, they got a couple experts, how when they're doing articles, they got to grab some experts. And he goes, "That's ridiculous. Stress doesn't make you fat." And of course, I'm just laughing now because going forward, I had published in the National Academy of Sciences. And, now everybody and his brother, what's the first thing they say? Stress is going to make you And I sit back and I go, gotta hold on to yourself and stay strong until, there's a real tsunami of, studies that help confirm and affirm everything you were doing. And I think that you're on to something big here. And, it would be great if you continued to expand this and maybe turn this into a little world, a Facebook-y kind of thing, a collective, people who are happy to slip and slide, who I'm just imagining how this whole thing could actually blow out. I'm giving you some free branding advice here. But this could really kind of go somewhere. I don't know who else is out there doing this. You're the one who knows that. But you got some fantastic coverage in the New York Times. And Mallary, my advice to you is run with this, because I think that, this is going to end up being bigger than you think.
Thank you so much for that. I really hope that in some ways it becomes a movement where we can really just create these communities of support for people who find themselves in this middle place. And I hope that I can give talks at treatment centers and really just be a resource for folks who find themselves in this space. And I hope that it changes conversations around what it means to recover, and that it creates a more inclusive approach to recovery, because I think that a lot of people have felt excluded because of the very limited ways in which we've talked about recovery from an eating disorder.
Create a community. I think people need a community out there, and just noodle on some of these thoughts that I'm sharing here with you, because this is so cool. I love it. So everyone out there, we have been talking with Mallary Tenore Tarpley. Now I'm going to spell that Tarpley. And I want you to see if you can get on over to her website. It's Mallary, Mallary, Tenore, Tenore, and then Tarpley, Tarpley. Oh, hell, just look up, SLIP, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, SLIP. Okay. And you'll remember it as such. And then you'll be able to, see how her name is spelled and run on over to her website, where I think she's going to be creating a community. I could be wrong.
No, I love your idea. I might steal that.
No, I'm gifting you with it. Been there, done that, girlfriend. And I want to see you thrive, because if you do, then that makes me incredibly happy. So as we bring this all together, all I can tell you is thank you for being on the Her podcast, Mallary.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a true joy, and I've loved talking with you, and hope your listeners get a lot out of it.
Oh, heck yeah. And I also want to thank my sponsors, Solaray Vitamins, Minerals and Herbs Rooted in Nature, and the new Her Life Stages products. I want you to scope out the Solaray products at Solaray, SOLARAY.com. And hey, take a moment to leave us a review, because I don't know, we just sit around waiting to hear from you. I mean, seriously, that's what we do. All right. This has been a production of Podcast Health. I got a little reminder for you. Your time in this world may be limited, but the things you can do with that time are not. So get on out there, every single one of you, and seize the day. Carpe diem. Thanks for listening, everyone.